Insomniacs Anonymous presents the retelling of true stories collected from the darkest corners of the web. My mum used to clean houses. She quit after this. In the mid-80s, my mum was a cleaner in Australia. She would clean houses in suburban areas and would sometimes do houses in rural wine regions. We lived near both. She would leave business cards at local shops and get most of her business this way, and some through referrals and word of mouth. One day she got a call from a lady who sounded like she was in her 60s, asking Mum to clean her old farmhouse. She made a lot of odd demands, and my mum would usually meet clients before taking on new business. In this case, the lady did not want to meet Mum and said she would leave the keys under the front doormat. Mum agreed, mainly because the lady was quite obviously wealthy and was offering to pay Mum substantially more than she would reasonably expect. Mum went to the house on a Monday morning and said she already felt unnerved by the long driveway. The house was essentially in the middle of a very large, very empty property. She found the keys and started cleaning. About an hour into the clean, she hears the back door shut. Mum was told no one else would be at the property, so she immediately felt unsafe. She stood frozen in the kitchen for what she said felt like 3 to 4 minutes, although she said it could have been much longer. There was no other car on the property. She wanted to leave immediately, but had just 2 rooms left to clean. Both were bedrooms. She said as time passed and she heard nothing else, she decided that perhaps it was nothing, or something had fallen, or maybe it was the wind and not a door after all. She walked up the hallway and stepped into the bedroom. All over the bed were black and white photos. As Mum got closer, she realized the photos were all of her. Some of them were taken at our family home, and many others were taken at other houses Mum would clean. Some were through windows or over fences. She used the house phone to call the police and immediately drive to the end of the driveway. The lady ended up being investigated, but claimed that it was a break-in and she had nothing to do with it. After some time, the police stopped with their searching, and we ended up moving to a new town 4 months later. Every time my mum tells me this story, I get serious chills. To this day, my mum thinks the lady had something to do with it. But why? And for what purpose? Roommate wanted, female only. This is a popular story with my family and friends. Amanda is my brother's girlfriend. At the time of this story, she was looking for her first apartment, moving out from her parents' house. Her and my brother didn't want to move in together since they'd only dated for a few months. She opted instead to search for a roommate online. Browsing through Craigslist, she found an ad titled something like, "Roommate wanted, female only." This sort of thing was common since the area she was looking in was mostly young professionals. The listing was for a room in a house for about $225 a month, which was quite cheap compared to most other places listed. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student that wasn't comfortable living with males. The other roommate would have a room of their own with a bathroom attached. So far, Amanda was really into this place. However, the listing had only a single photo from outside the property. Amanda sent an email wanting to meet the occupant and get a tour of the house. Within 30 minutes, she receives an email back with the details and a suggested time to stop by. The girl worked late hours and wanted Amanda to stop by at 8 p.m. When Amanda arrives, there is a handwritten note on the front door saying, "Door broken, use the back door." Walking around the house, it looks nice, but slightly unkept. Tall grass, weeds, dusty windows, etc. Still no alarms for Amanda though. When she knocks on the back door, an older man opens the door. At first Amanda thinks she has the wrong house, but the man reassures her and says that the occupant was out and he was the landlord. He seemed pleasant and offered to show her around. At this point, alarms do start going off, but it's not a red alert yet. The guy was clearly in his 40s, unshaven, and looked like he lived in his car. Also, only the kitchen light was on. As they walked around the house, Amanda noticed one huge red flag. There was no furniture, nothing. It was sparse. The landlord was polite about answering questions, but seemed irritable to keeping the lights on for too long, rushing her around and only letting her look at rooms for a few moments. There was a single room that the landlord wouldn't open, telling her that it was the occupant's room, and he didn't want to invade her privacy. As they walked down the hallway into the living room, she noticed the front door has a plank nailed across it. Amanda's creepometer is starting to ding, so she decides to wrap up the walkthrough and leave, trying to be polite as possible. As she's trying to wrap up with the guy, he perks up and states that he forgot to show her the basement. It's recently furnished and would be a great rec room, and she should take a look down there. At the time, Amanda and the landlord are standing in the small hallway between the front living room and the back kitchen. In this little hallway was a basement door. When he opens the door, it opens outward to create something of a barrier between Amanda and the back door. The basement is pitch black. He smiles, motions down the stairs and says, "Ladies first." What happens next is nothing more than a stroke of luck. Amanda gets a text just as some random car parks in front of the house. Thinking on her feet, she pretends it's a phone call and answers her phone. "Hey, yeah, are you here? I'll come out from around back and let you in. It looks great, you'll have to see it." With a motion of confidence, she excuses herself around the landlord and walks out the back door. She says the guy just looked like he was confused. Once outside, she sprinted to her car and sped like hell out of there. When Amanda got home, she told her mother and my brother everything. The cops were called. They took her statement and went to investigate. The Craigslist post has since been removed. It turned out the house had been foreclosed 6 months earlier and the property had been abandoned. When the police investigated, they found that the closed room the landlord didn't want her to look in was where the man had been staying. There was a pile of old, dirty blankets, rotten food, and empty gallon jugs everywhere. More creepy was that he had plastered ripped-up pages from adult magazines all over the walls in the room. The really scary part was the basement. The man had tied a thin piece of fishing twine at about shin level across the stairs around halfway down. The basement was empty except for another pile of old blankets, a broom handle wrapped in leather belts, and a small box with a few rolls of assorted tapes. Amanda ended up not moving in. The Smiling Man. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major US city. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite, but all of that changed one evening. It was Wednesday, somewhere between 1 or 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park, quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box step with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, heading straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass by me. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, wearing an old suit. He danced closer still until I could make out his face. His eyes were open and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was held painfully in a wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and the sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street, and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time staring at him, and then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps, as if he was a cartoon character sneaking up on somebody, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away, or pulled out a pepper spray or my cell phone, or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen, as the smiling man crept toward me, and then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking at the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What the hell do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What the fuck? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started dance walking away, just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him, I just watched him go, and he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side of the road and back into the better lit road. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile. But he was never there. I lived in that city 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that's always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane, and that's a very, very scary thing to see. One decision. When I was a teenager, I was a goth. Black hair, black clothes, black makeup. I even had a pair of combat boots. My friends and I, in typical goth fashion, hung out at the local cemetery. We started going as a joke, but soon discovered we liked the peace we found there. That all changed one night. My friend called to see if I wanted to hang out, and I did. None of our other friends were available. They were all either working or recovering from partying the night before, so we were on our own. My friend picked me up and we drove to the cemetery. We were hanging out, smoking cigs, and BSing about on the latest issues she was having with her boyfriend when we noticed at the top of the hill we were on, about 100 feet away, a bonfire had been lit. You have to understand that this cemetery is about a block off campus of a major university, and it's not uncommon for college students to go party there. My friend and I sighed, knowing that we'd have to get going soon. It was illegal to be in the cemetery after dark, and we knew the police would show up because some jerks had decided they needed a bonfire. We decided to finish our cigs and then take off. Just then, the most horrible stench came wafting down the side of the hill from the direction of the bonfire. My friend gagged and covered her mouth. I groaned and said, "What the hell is that?" My friend shook her head saying, "I don't know what they're doing, let's just leave." We get in the car and one of us suggested, I honestly don't remember who, maybe we should just go up and see what they're doing. My stomach turned and a cold shiver went through my body. My friend must have had the same feeling because at the same time we both said, "No, we should leave." My friend started the car, switched on the headlights, put it in reverse and looked over her shoulder. I was still looking up the hill. A figure stepped out in front of the bonfire. I could only see a silhouette, but I was sure whoever it was watching us. A feeling of terror hit me and I said, "Go, go, go, go," getting louder and more panicked with each word. My friend looked back up the hill for a second, just as the figure took a step towards us. She slammed on the gas and peeled out, going in reverse down the hill. She rammed the gear shift into drive and we were out of there. We didn't say anything for a while until she said, "What the hell were they burning?" I shook my head. "I don't know." She dropped me off at home and I went to bed. The next morning I woke up and went out to the kitchen. My mum was standing there, drinking her morning coffee, and I joined her. We talked about her job for a bit, and then she suddenly comes out with, "Did you hear what happened last night?" I shrugged and say no, I'd just gotten up. She told me that a woman she worked with was kidnapped from the parking garage. "Oh my God," I say, "did they find her?" "Yes, but too late," Mum replied. "Whoever took her had raped her and murdered her. They found her this morning in the cemetery. They had tried to dispose of her body in a fire." I froze. My brain was going a mile a minute, the realization slowly creeping. That's what that smell was. Needless to say, I never hung out in the cemetery again at night. I think back to our decision to leave instead of investigating the fire. That one decision could have changed everything. Rick, the long-haul trucker. This happened in 1985 when I was 17 years old. I was the youngest of my graduating class, and all summer I had been looking at colleges across the region. This was long enough ago that it was before the internet, and if you wanted to go to college out of state and you didn't have tons of money or connections, you actually had to take a trip. I was born in Seattle, but at the time my family had been living in Mount Shasta, which is a small town in Northern California. I was unable to attend college on time with the rest of my friends because I ended up having to stay home to take care of my mother. She had been diagnosed with cancer at the end of summer, and my dad had to continue working 10-hour days to pay the bills. So, I took care of my mum for a year while Dad worked. Luckily, my mum didn't have to suffer for long. The cancer had progressed so far by the time they'd caught it that she passed in the fall. After my mother had passed away, my dad made sure I started to go to college as soon as possible. I knew I wanted to go to school in Seattle because the big city life was calling to me. Dad basically handed me $500 and the key to his old 1982 Chevy pickup and told me to go, and that when I got there he'd send me money to get an apartment so I could get settled in the city before school started. He didn't want any obstacles in my way when it came to school. He felt guilty for having kept me home while my mum was dying. Not that I would have chosen to be anywhere else, but he was still feeling guilty. So in the middle of fall, I ended up driving my dad's truck north to Seattle. The trip is basically a straight shot from Mount Shasta to Seattle on the Interstate 5. It should have been easy, but about halfway through Oregon, the pickup broke down. A coolant hose had sprung a leak, and I was unable to repair it on the side of the road. So I ended up walking on the side of the interstate northward in the direction of the next town. I had just passed a small town named Greene a while back, and the map said I was just south of a medium-sized town named Roseburg. I couldn't be sure how far away I was from Roseburg, but walking wasn't a problem for me, and Roseburg would be much more likely to have a repair shop. So even if it might be further away, it was totally worth the attempt. It was cold that evening, and the windshield was cutting through my coat and causing me to hate life. I decided it would be best to hitch a ride to Roseburg, since it was quickly getting dark. I thought I looked pretty hot back then, but even still, no one stopped to give me a ride. I kept walking north and putting my thumb out every time a car came up behind me. It was hours later when one finally stopped. It was a big red 18-wheeler that had no trailer attached. It pulled up in front of me, off to the side of the road, and honked its horn. I ran up to the truck, thankful that I could finally get out of the wind. As I opened the passenger side door of the truck, I saw a very friendly-looking man at the wheel. He smiled at me and said, "Come on up inside," as I climbed into the passenger seat. He told me his name was Rick, and I introduced myself in turn. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him that I needed to get to Roseburg to get a tow truck to pick up my vehicle. He told me that he'd been to Roseburg many times on his routes, and there wasn't a repair shop or tow company open this late at night. He told me he would let me out at a motel so I could sleep the night and then get a tow truck to pick up my vehicle the next morning. I thanked him for his considerate nature. He really did seem kind and thoughtful. We weren't far from Roseburg according to him, which made sense because we could just now begin to see the signs of civilization among the trees on the side of the interstate. We made small talk while he drove the rest of the way. We discussed the cold weather, current events, and sports. Somewhere during the conversation he told me that I was very pretty. It caught me off guard, but he didn't say it in a creepy way, so I merely thanked him and continued talking about sports. He didn't say anything after that, kind of just let me talk. You know that feeling you get when you realize you've been chatting on and on about something, and the other person hasn't said a word for a few minutes? I got that feeling because he hadn't said a word since he told me I was pretty. I stopped and apologized for being so chatty and talking his ear off. He looked at me and smiled and said it was alright. He liked to hear my pretty voice. That time he did say it in a creepy way. I kept quiet in the hopes he'd start talking and we'd discuss something else. Instead, we didn't say a word. He watched the road and I just sat there. In a minute I began looking around the cab, and I ended up looking in the back of the cab behind me. What I saw puzzled me. In the back, there was a large brown blanket, some clothes I'm pretty sure were dirty, and some shoes. But the thing that puzzled me was that they weren't all his clothes and shoes. Two of the shoes were obviously little girl's shoes, and some of the clothes were little girl's clothes. Something you'd expect a 10-year-old to wear. He knew I seen it, and laughed. He told me his daughter left those in the cab, as she'd accompanied him on a route last week. He told me he didn't get enough time to spend with her, so he took her on a route to spend some quality time together. I said that was nice of him and asked him how old she was. He paused for a second and then told me she was 13. That made me suspicious. Not only did he hesitate before answering, but I've worked in a shoe store and I know those shoes must belong to a much younger girl, both because of the size and the style. It was weird. Also, having worked at a shoe store before, I was almost positive the shoes were two different sizes. I told him the shoes were cute, and I leaned back and grabbed onto them to prove to myself that they had to be different sizes, and no way does a little girl wear two totally different sizes. Still, at this point I wasn't really scared. I just thought he wasn't being totally honest. It's just a weird thing to be dishonest about, even to a stranger. I put the shoe back, and when I turned around, I saw the look on his face. It seemed half worried, half angry. I immediately apologized for touching his things, and he said it was okay, although it didn't look okay. By then we were just entering Roseburg. We kept driving through the small town, and he told me he knew a good motel on the far end of town, and he'd let me out there. He asked me what I'd brought with me in my backpack. It seemed like an innocent question, but it came off like he was interested in what I had on me, not simply whether or not I'd brought any clothes or a toothbrush. I told him I had enough, but I didn't tell him anything specific about the contents of my backpack. I didn't have a weapon of any type, just some socks, makeup, and my purse. We ended up passing a repair shop on the side of the road, and he pointed to it and told me that's the place I should go tomorrow morning to get a tow truck. It felt kind of strange to me because he didn't tell me it was coming up, he just pointed it out. I said I'd missed it, and I asked what the name of the shop was. He responded by just telling me it was straight south of the interstate, and I can't miss it. At this point, I began to get a little worried. I didn't feel threatened by Rick, but he didn't seem to be legit. As we kept driving, I noticed we were now coming to the far north end of Roseburg, and that we'd soon be leaving the town behind. I asked him where this motel is, and he told me it was just north of the town. I told him that was a little far from the repair shop for me and asked if there was a place closer for me to stay. He didn't answer. Now I'm growing worried about Rick's intentions for me. I got my backpack and put it on my lap. I looked over and smiled at him and told him I was okay, just cold. You know those signs on the highway that tell you how far the next rest stop is? Gas station, motel? Well, they had those signs back then too, but usually only on the outskirts of a town. Well, we came up on one of those signs. It said there wouldn't be a motel for 20 miles, and we were leaving Roseburg. I knew then that Rick wasn't taking me to a motel just past the town's limit. I didn't know what he wanted, but I didn't want it to happen. I looked over slowly at Rick, and luckily he hadn't seen the sign, because he was busy lighting a cigarette. I began looking frantically out the window to see if there were any places I could make an excuse to stop at. Maybe I could ask to stop at a gas station for something to drink and then run away. There didn't appear to be one open though. I looked over at him and asked if he'd pull over to let me pee on the side of the road. He pulled his lit cigarette out of his mouth and just looked at me. He asked, "You gotta pee?" I shook my head yes. "Well, go pee then, Jenny," he told me. "I like the smell." And he smiled at me, and it sent shivers down my spine. I pretended to laugh, and he frowned at me. "Don't fucking laugh at me, Jenny," he told me. I immediately stopped pretending to be fine, and so did Rick. He could tell I was scared now, and he just gave me this look like he wanted to hit me. I asked him where we were going, and he told me not to worry about that. At this point, I could actually see the end of Rosenberg coming up ahead. No more lights after that, just woods. Immediately I heard my dad's voice in my head telling me to run, not to worry about getting hurt, just run. I opened the door and tried to jump out. The truck must have been moving at 30 to 40 miles per hour. As I moved towards the open door, Rick grabbed my backpack. He'd been trying to grab me, but I was pressed against the far end of the cab. I heard my dad's voice again telling me to run, and I tried to pull my backpack away from Rick, but his grip was too strong. I gave up and just fell back out of the cab and into the grass. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I rolled around in the grass until I came to a stop. Immediately I sat up despite the sharp pain in my back and saw Rick's truck speeding up on his way out of the town. He didn't stop. I got up and limped my way back into town and ran to the first home I saw, pounding on the front door. An old man opened the door, looking very tired yet also very worried. I begged him to call the cops, and when he saw the bruises on my face and the grass stains on my clothes, he threw open the door and let me in. He sat me on the couch while he ran to the phone. His wife came down to find me on the couch crying and him on the phone telling the local sheriff to come as soon as possible. The sheriff arrived and expected me to be drunk. About halfway through my story he realized I wasn't and I was telling the truth. He called up 2 deputies who were asleep at home and had them patrol north on the interstate looking for a big red 18-wheeler. He even called up the next town north and asked them to send a patrol south. They didn't find any 18-wheelers on the road, but assumed he probably sped his way right through their town too. The nice couple who had let me in let me stay with them for the night, and the sheriff kept a deputy outside the house all night. The next day they took me to the station to fill out an official report and look at some photos of 18-wheelers so I could pick out the exact colour and model. They towed my truck in, and the sheriff's department even paid for it. They got my dad's pickup running in no time, and the sheriff asked me to stay in town for a few more nights. I was fine with that because I didn't want to meet Rick on the road again. I did stay in contact with the sheriff and the old couple who helped me. The couple both passed away about 1.5 years later. I went to their funerals and spoke to their kids, who were about my dad's age at the time, and told them everything their parents had done for me. They were very proud. The sheriff would call me from time to time and ask me if he could send some photos. It seemed every few months he would arrest a trucker who had a red semi or very similar vehicle, and would want me to see if I recognized him. Odds are Rick was a crazy serial killer, or at least a child abductor or predator, and there is no way to know where he is now. At the time I suspected he was around 40, which means now he'd be in his 70s and probably no longer on the road. The sheriff told me many years later that there are tons of old folk in retirement homes who have no families and no one ever visits them, and Rick is probably living that kind of life now, if he's still alive. Wherever Rick is now, I hope he never really hurt anyone, or at least I hope he never hurt anyone ever again. But if he did, especially if he hurt two little girls whose clothes he had in his truck, I hope wherever he is, he's suffering and alone. We never did find Rick. Well, that's all for this episode. I look forward to the next one.